All right. So, yeah, my name's Lee. I'm with the Massapequa Library, and we're very happy today to have a presentation on Fire Island from Kelsey from the National Park Service. We're really looking forward to the talk. Before the presentation starts, I want to tell everybody to, if you can, please be courteous. Stay muted until the end if you can do it. There'll be a question and answer session at the end. And, I'll keep an eye out, make sure there's no crazy Jimmy Hedrick's feedback or anything like that. But we're glad you're here, and we're looking forward to the talk. So having said that, thanks again, Kelsey.
Hey.
Yeah.
Well, so I already answered a couple questions for folks, but I'm gonna say, just to start off, I'm gonna stick around at the end. Hopefully we don't go over time. I'll try to make sure we stay on time. I think we have about an hour for the talk.
Yeah, that's
cool.
right.
All right, but if you guys have questions, we'll have an opportunity sort of at the end to sort of question and answer. I also apologize, I'm fading in and out. I've got the Sunken Forest behind me. I thought it would be appropriate. It is night outside, so if I was out there, you wouldn't see very much. But I did put together a nice, well, I think it's nice, I don't know, you'll have to tell me, slideshow all about the Sunken Forest, a little bit about Fire Island, really what makes this place really special. And I'm going to sort of run through that with you. And then at the end of the program, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But yeah, I think I'm going to start just by sharing my screen and jumping right into the PowerPoint. Let's see. I'm going to share this screen. Let me know. Do you see my notes?
We don't see your notes. I think you're good.
You just see a slide that says the Sunken Forest, right?
Correct. We just see a slide that says the Sunken Forest.
Sweet. Okay, that's really helpful. If it was my notes, you'd see, hi, my name is Kelsey. I've been working for the National Seashore now for 10 years. I started when I was 16 as a park ranger. I actually started earlier as a volunteer when I was 13. So I've been out here for a long time. I like to think that I know Fire Island really intimately. This is a place where I really grew up. It's a place that I hold dear. Now, I will say, of all of the places on Fire Island, the Sunken Forest is kind of the coolest. We like to call it our crown jewel. This is an incredibly unique ecosystem. It's a very rare place. It's a place that we want to make sure we are obviously protecting, preserving, and making sure that other future generations can enjoy. So I'm really excited to be talking to you guys all about the Sunken Forest. Before I really start to dig into the Sunken Forest stuff, oh, hold on a second. Got to make sure I can change to the next slide. Okay. Before I really dig into the Sunken Forest, I really want to start just by talking a little bit about Fire Isalnd National Seashore. Now, just to confirm, you guys can see the slide that says Fire Isalnd National Seashore?
Yeah, that's fine. We can see that. Great.
Sweet. So Fire Isalnd National Seashore is one of 10 national seashores, including places like Cape Cod, Cape Hatteras, Point Reyes. National seashores are obviously, as their name implies, these sort of federal sites on the ocean. The National Park Service manages over 420, I believe right now it's 423 or 424, somewhere around there. The number's always changing. National sites. So that can include, for example, national parks. You can imagine places like Yellowstone or Yosemite. That can also include like national memorials, national monuments, national lake shores, national rivers, and things like that. National recreational areas. So Fire Island is one of 10 national seashores, one of over 420 National Park Service sites all across America. It's really the mission of the National Park Service to preserve and protect these places. These are obviously really special places where literally millions of people visit every single year. They come out here to enjoy a broad range of subjects, everything from like the natural landscape that we have to the historical landscape. It's really our job to make sure that these places are preserved so that we can continue to enjoy them, so that we can go there and visit these places, and also make sure that our kids and other future generations can enjoy them as well. So Fire Island itself is a pretty complicated place to describe. From one end to the other, Fire Island is 32 miles long, from Democrat Point on the west end all the way to Mauritius Inlet over on the east end. Now, within the boundaries, well, on Fire Island, the National Seashore manages about 26 miles of that 32-mile long barrier island. We also have several visitor sites. The Fire Island Lighthouse is a great place to visit. There's a lot of history, a lot of maritime history, this really rich cultural heritage there. Really cool museum. You can actually walk all the way up to the top of the lighthouse. I know, there are other lighthouses on Long Island. Some of them are a little older. This one, you can walk up and you get a really beautiful view. On a nice day, if you're lucky, you might get a view of like New York City if it's clear. So it's a really beautiful place to visit. We have the Sunken Forest, Sailor's Haven. That's another visitor site. That's what we're going to be focusing in on today. We also have Talisman, Barrett Beach, kind of an isolated, quiet spot of Fire Island National Seashore. Talisman and Barrett Beach is really only accessible by private boat. Further along, we have Watch Hill. There is a visitor center there, a really cool salt marsh trail. Watch Hill is very recreationally oriented. So there are some great hiking trails. There's a really beautiful nature trail that's easy to walk along. We also offer backcountry camping, as well as like family, like campsite camping over there. We do canoe programs, and we have a lifeguarded beach there as well. So it's a really cool place to go, especially with your family, if you just want to spend the day out on the beach. Further along, we have the Fireline Wilderness. It's actually Wilderness Month. This is a really special time to be talking about it. The Fireline Wilderness is the only federally designated wilderness area in all of New York State. It stretches 7 miles from Watch Hill all the way over to Smith Point County Park it's next to. Even though it is 7 miles long, which is pretty significant, it also happens to be one of the National Park Service's smallest wilderness areas. And the reason why is because Fire Island is so thin, the acreage is really low. So it may be really long, but it's really narrow. And then further along on Long Island itself, we have an historic site, the William Floyd Estate, which is managed by Fire Island National Seashore. So that's just the national park, right? We have all these different visitor sites within the boundaries of the national park. And this is where it really gets to be very complicated. We have 17 private communities. Each one of those communities has its own history, its own legacy. Each one has its own culture, really. Some of them are managed by the town of Brookhaven. Some are managed by the town of Islip. Some are private villages that sort of manage themselves. And so you can imagine, like, coming out to Fire Island can be really complicated if you don't know where to go, if you don't know what you want to do. Which is why I always tell people Sailor's Haven and the Sunken Forest is a really good place to start. So, sorry, I am having some issues with my computer. All right. So how do we get to Sailor's Haven? The main way to get to Sailor's Havens for most visitors is actually by by taking the ferry. So we have a ferry service that runs out of Sayville. You may also know of the Patchogue ferry service, which runs to Watch Hill, and the Bay Shore ferry service, which runs mainly to the private communities. Well, the ferry service that you want to take if you're planning on coming out to Sailor's Haven and the Sunken Forest is going to be the one that runs out of Sayville. You can also take a private boat. There's a mid-sized marina. It is public, available for people. If you wanted to come out and dock your boat, there are some amenities over there. Now, one of the things that I always tell people is that, like, most people visit the Sunken Forest in the summer. It's really a summer-oriented park. People want to go into the forest. The ferries are running. The beaches are open. We have lifeguards out there. A lot of people come in the summers. But believe it or not, we still have service running out to Sailor's Haven through most of the fall, all the way through like mid-October. You can see ferries on a pretty regular basis running. And then after that point, sometimes there are ferries that run all the way through the winter to nearby communities like Cherry Grove. So I always tell people, the summer is a cool time to be out here, but the fall is a really cool time to be out here. If you wanted to visit in the middle of the fall, we do have a lot of changing colors, fall foliage, things like that. There's a really exciting variety of mushrooms that you'll see growing in the forest. You'll also see a lot of flowering plants in the fall, things like goldenrod, right? Things that a lot of people don't see because they're not visiting the beach in fall. They're really coming to the beach in the middle of the summer. So if you can make it out to Fire Island and to the Sunken Forest in the fall, I highly recommend it. We also usually have some ferry service in spring, so that's maybe something you consider as well. Now, Sailor's Haven is a cool place. We have a couple of different amenities available to people who like to visit. We have a snack bar and a concession stand, so you can, find food there. We have our visitor center, like this one up at the top of these steps. Obviously, there's the Sunken Forest, and then there's the life-guarded Ocean Beach. And then there are trails that can take you over to the private communities, places like Cherry Grove, if you wanted to go for a walk and see one of the towns. So you can see all of that from Sailor's Haven. Now, one of the things that I really like about Sailor's Haven is that from Sailor's Haven, this is again where the Sunken Forest is, it's at Sailor's Haven. From Sailor's Haven, you get a really cool view of all of the different ecosystems, all of the diversity of ecosystems that Fire Island supports. And so we're going to just take a quick walk from the ocean, which is on the south side of Fire Island, and we're going to head up to the north side of Fire Island, where the Great South Bay is, and we're going to explore each one of those habitats really briefly. You can see all of these habitats from Sailor's Haven and the Sunken Forest. The first habitat that we really have is the Ocean Beach. This is a relatively barren landscape. There's not a lot living out there. Most of the plants that you start to see on the Ocean Beach are going to be like tall beach grasses, things like American beach grass, which is one of the coolest plants we have on Fire Island, though probably one of the easiest to overlook. That American beach grass has this long system of roots that interconnect. They actually hold on to each other, and in holding on to each other, they help to build up the dune line. That's where we get these beautiful primary dunes. Now, park rangers, we're always out there telling people to get off the dunes. We ask people to stay off of the dunes, and there's a reason for that. Fire Island is a barrier island. It's constantly changing. It's being affected by storms, by forces, winds, waves, things like that. Well, this dune that the grass builds is what I like to call the backbone of the island. This is really the thing that holds all of Fire Island together. So the reason why park rangers tell you to stay off of it is because it's fragile on one hand and because it's really important on the other hand. Now, back behind the primary dune, you start to see a different environment. This is what we call our swale. I always called this like our desert. And I call it our desert because it's this big, wide open space. It gets really hot out here. The sun can really beat down. You have the dunes on both sides, the primary dune on one side and the secondary dune on the other side. Both of those dunes are actually going to refract light back into this landscape. At the same time, they're going to block wind from getting in here. So you walk through the swale in the middle of the summer and it gets really hot. You get a nasty sunburn. But the swale is a really cool place. There's so much life growing in the swale. There's so many animals. There's a ton of biodiversity in the swale habitat. The swale is obviously a lot more lush than the Ocean Beach. There's more stuff growing. Most of the stuff that's growing in the swale is going to be a little bit more complicated than grass. You're going to start to see like woody plants, more like bushes, shrubs, things like that. Occasionally you even start to get pine trees, black cherries, and other trees growing in the swale habitat. We also get cactus, which is just one of the reasons why I call it the desert on Fire Island. Now, this habitat is more lush because it is being protected from the ocean, from those forces I mentioned a minute ago, by the primary dune. In this picture, if you look at the left-hand side of this trail, you can see the primary dune, that big hump on the horizon. That hump is acting as a shield to protect the swale. Now, the swale is still a somewhat difficult habitat for most plants to survive in. Because it is so desert-like, all the animals and all of the plants that survive in the swale have to be well adapted to survive here. Many of the plants like bayberry, for example, actually have this waxy coat that covers their berries in order to help retain moisture, because again, it gets so hot in the swale. So, long story short, the swale is a little further back behind the dunes. It's a little bit more lush because it's being protected from the ocean by the dunes, but it's not as lush as the forest that we're going to see. Past the swale, we start to see our secondary dunes. These are actually ancient dune lines, like the remnants of ancient dunes that long ago were primary dunes on the Ocean Beach. Slowly over time, storm after storm, just as the island has gradually changed, those primary dunes were pushed further and further back until they became this secondary dune line. Now, what's unique about Sailor's Haven and the Sunken Forest even compared to the rest of Fire Island, is that we have some of the largest secondary dunes on the island. And so, as we'll talk about in a little bit, these secondary dunes are absolutely critical. Because when I said the primary dunes help to protect the swale, well, the secondary dunes are going to give even more protection to what grows behind them. Now, what grows behind them is going to be the sunken forest itself. Sunken Forest and my buddy Jonathan. We do tours of the Sunken Forest. We have excellent rangers, myself included, who will be happy to take you through the forest. But yeah, so the forest sort of comes next. Now I'm going to pause on the forest, or I'm going to pocket the forest. We're going to come back to it later because that's what we're talking about mostly today. We're going to move on to some other things that you'll see on Fire Island real quick. Next up, we have freshwater wetlands on Fire Island. These freshwater wetlands run the gamut. Sometimes they're bogs, sometimes they're swamps. We have freshwater marshes on Fire Island. These are all basically parts of Fire Island that have dipped low enough for fresh rainwater to collect. Now, underneath all of Fire Island is a thin, what we call the freshwater lens. It's a lens of freshwater that is propped up by saltwater. Saltwater being heavier, more dense, actually pushes freshwater up towards the surface. And where the ground meets that freshwater lens is where we get these freshwater wetlands, especially when it rains, it starts to flood a little bit. So this is a little bit of a swampier habitat. This is actually kind of a spooky picture. And I think we'll come back to it a little later. We'll talk about what makes this sort of a spooky picture, but I just want to put that in your head. So these wetlands are also really cool, really important, really lush. We see blueberries in here. We see cranberries. We see blackberries in here. So all things that we really love. You'll see tons of dragonflies visiting these landscapes, turtles, snapping turtles, things like that. So these are really lush places. Fresh water. So actually, if you're looking to see wildlife, I always love to wait around the freshwater wetlands because these wetlands are often like the watering hole for many of the animals that live in the forest. Now, those freshwater wetlands, they start to give way to saltwater, wetlands, mainly our salt marshes. Now, this photo, actually, I'm cheating a little bit because this photo is not a photo from Sailor's Haven. This is a photo from Watch Hill. Watch Hill is really lucky because Watch Hill has actually one of the largest systems of salt marshes we have on Fire Island. Now, the picture I'm showing you right now is specifically of one salt marsh plant, one of my favorite plants. This is sometimes called sea pickle or a glasswort. Salicornia is the scientific name for this variety of plant. This is an ancient species of plant. They've been around since before levee plants were around. They're sort of like a succulent in many ways. And one of the really cool things that you're going to start seeing, if not now, I haven't been to Watch Hill in a couple days, but maybe in a couple weeks we'll start seeing it happen. Well, this weird little salt marsh plant actually changes fall colors. So in the middle of the fall, you'll go out to the salt marsh and you'll see it's glowing orange and red and yellow, all of these beautiful colors. And you think, well, that feels a lot like a forest, upstate. Well, much like those forests change fall colors, so does the Salicornia, which is where we get these really beautiful red plants. So the salt marsh is a really lush habitat, actually really important habitat for shellfish, clams, oysters, mussels, crabs, small fish, and things like that. This is something we might refer to as a little bit of an estuary habitat because we're getting a little closer to the next place, which is the Great South Bay. And then as Long Islanders, you guys are probably familiar with the Great South Bay. The Great South Bay is actually a system of smaller bays. I've heard from a scientist who insists on referring to them not as bays, but actually as lagoons. And he has his own reasons for that. But so this is a really cool habitat. It's obviously wedged between Fire Island to the south and Long Island up north, filled with all sorts of wildlife. You'll see horseshoe crabs in here. You'll see oyster catchers. You'll see willets. You'll see a ton of different migrating birds that like to pass through. Now I'm going to double back because I said we'd talk about the Sunken Forest today, and here I am talking about all of Fire Island. I just want to real quick say we're going to explore the Sunken Forest moving forward. But as cool as like virtual spaces are, as fun as it is to be able to come to you guys and talk to you over the computers, the thing that we really want to see is you guys coming out to the park, visiting it for yourself. So come on out. We still have ranger guided tours every weekend. That's Saturdays and Sundays. You can check our website for information if you wanted to know, if you were thinking about coming next year, perhaps. check out our website because we put everything up on our calendar. So the obvious question is, all right, we talked about all these different habitats. We talked about the Fire Island. We talked about the National Seashore. I keep talking about the Sunken Forest as if it's the special thing. Well, what is the Sunken Forest exactly? The Sunken Forest is a globally rare maritime ecosystem. In fact, there are only 2 forests like this on the entire planet. The other forest is not far from here, actually. It's also protected by the National Park Service. It's part of Gateway National Recreational Area. It's in Sandy Hook, New Jersey. So a very similar climate range to the forest that we have, the Sunken Forest here on Fire Island. Our forest is a little older. Our forest is a little larger. Unfortunately, Hurricane Sandy did a lot more damage to their forest than the Sunken Forest. So in many ways, this forest, the Sunken Forest, represents like this real example of just profound biodiversity on the planet. So it's this very rare place. Now, what do I mean by that? What is the Sunken Forest exactly? Well, there are 2 words that we use to describe the Sunken Forest. We call it a maritime holly forest. Now, just jumping real quick into that first word, what is maritime? Well, when I hear the word maritime, it's usually next to another word, maritime history. I always think of the history of pirates and shipwrecks and lighthouses, right? So if we're talking about a maritime forest, then we're talking about a forest that is oceanside, right? Near the ocean. Now, maritime forests are not necessarily uncommon. You see maritime forests, there are other maritime forests on Fire Island. There are maritime forests all up and down the coast. You'll see forests made up of mangroves. You'll see pine forests, like is the case on Long Island as well. So maritime forests are somewhat uncommon, but they're not all that uncommon. The thing that really makes the Sunken Forest unique is that other word. I said it's a maritime forest and it's also a holly forest. Most of the trees that grow in the Sunken Forest are a species called American holly. We'll jump into American holly a little later, but real quick, I want to just point out, you can see holly, you're probably kind of familiar with it already. We deck the halls with it during the holiday season, right? And you can see those pointed leaves that are so often associated with holly. So I'm going to put that in my pocket and we'll come back to holly in a little bit. Now, so it's a maritime holly forest, but why exactly is it called the Sunken Forest? A lot of people come to me, they say, well, I heard it's called the Sunken Forest because it's below sea level. That's not true. It's close to true. It's pretty close to sea level, but the Sunken Forest is for the most part still above sea level. You see, the reason why it's called the Sunken Forest is not because it's sunk below the sea, but because it's sunk below those secondary dunes. Here's a cross section of the island. We just talked about all of these different environments from the beach to the primary dune, the swale, the secondary dune, the forest, and the marsh, as well as the wetlands on the interior. Well, if you take a look at this illustration, you'll notice all of the trees almost look like they end right up at the top of that secondary dune. It's the way they end right up towards the top of that secondary dune that sort of hides them, shields them behind the dunes. If you're standing on the ocean beach, you can't see the Sunken Forest. If you're standing on top of the secondary dunes, on top of the primary dunes, you can't see the Sunken Forest. It's not until you start to walk down the secondary dune that you start to realize, oh, this is a tall forest. This is an old forest. This is a forest that's been here for a very long time. And so the reason why it's called the Sunken Forest is because it appears as though it's sunken into the dunes. Now, why does it appear sunken? Well, at Sailor's Haven, across all of Fire Island and in most maritime habitats, you have one very consistent force that's always in the air, whether you know it or not. And it's something we call salt spray. Now, salt spray is a result of the natural, as waves crash, they sort of toss all of this salt up into the air. Happens at all beaches. It's the reason why when you hang out at the beach long enough, especially on a windy day, you start to feel like you got salt all over your skin. Sometimes it can give you a nice exfoliation. The salt spray sweeping over the primary dune gets caught in that swale area we were talking about a moment ago. Oh, I wanted to go back, but I must have gone too far. It gets caught in that swale area. That's really important because if you're a plant, salt is really bad for you. When salt lands on your leaves, it's going to pull all of the moisture out of your leaves. When it lands on your fruit, it's going to pull all of the moisture out of your fruit. So as those waves crash, they're tossing all that salt up into the air, and that salt is really bad for the plants. It's really bad for you if you're a plant. But that salt also gets trapped in that swale area. Again, we have the very large set of primary dunes and then this very large set of ancient secondary dunes. Those dunes both work together. They act to shield the forest and allow it to grow. As a result, you see something really cool in the forest. We call it salt spray pruning. Salt spray sweeps over the tops of the trees. It actively trims the tops of the trees as it sweeps across, right? So it still gets over the trees, but it just doesn't fall, it doesn't kill the trees because the dunes, again, are protecting the trees. That's why when you go to the Sunken Forest, you're going to see a lot of really cool windswept type scenes like this, where the trees look like they're blowing in the wind, or it almost looks like a ranger came through and trimmed them with a hedge. Well, this is an all-natural feature, that sort of windswept motion on the tops of the trees. That occurs because of salt spray pruning. And it's that salt spray pruning that keeps the trees from growing above the dunes, right? I always think of it as a ceiling that sits over the forest. If they can't grow above that ceiling, they're going to stay below that ceiling. Sometimes they wiggle around and grow in all sorts of weird ways, like this oak I have behind me in my little box. They start to wiggle because they can't compensate for upward growth. So all sorts of very strange looking trees in the forest, again, because they can't grow above the secondary dune. That secondary dune acting as a shield to protect them. And that's all why it's called the Sunken Forest. I know it's a little complicated, but really it just looks like the trees sank into the dunes. It's that double dune system that really protects the forest. And it's one of the reasons why, again, the ranger's always telling you to stay off the dunes, because those dunes are critical. They're the shield that allows the forest to grow here at all. Now, I want to say salt spray is not all that bad. It doesn't only cause destruction. Of course, if there was too much salt spray, if the dunes were to disappear, for example, the forest would die off, because these trees, they're not well adapted to constant exposure to salt. But at the same time, that salt spray isn't just bringing in salt. It's also bringing in tons and tons of nutrients, things like algae, things like decaying plant and animal matter. And all of those things are actually acting as food for the forest. One of the funny things about Fire Island and Long Island is that in geological terms of geological history, these are actually relatively young landscapes. They've only been around since the end of the last ice age. And on a place as dynamic and ever-changing as Fire Island, really you don't get really a thick soil layer, right? Our soil layer in the Sunken Forest is very thin. If I took a shovel, I wouldn't have to dig very far to get to the sand underneath our soil layer. It's very thin compared to soil layers you're going to see up north in other old growth forests, because again, this landscape hasn't been here long enough. But if I were to take a look at that soil under a microscope, take a really close look at it, maybe test it for nutrients and things like that, I would find that that soil layer is absolutely packed with nutrients that feed these trees and allow them to grow. So there's this very delicate balance that happens in the forest. And this is something I really want to emphasize, because it's that balance that allows it to be here. Too much salt spray and this forest wouldn't exist. The trees can't survive in that much salt spray without those dunes to protect them. Not enough salt spray and this forest also wouldn't exist. It's that delicate balance with the salt spray that feeds the forest while also trimming the tops of the trees. It's those dunes that protect these trees. It's all of these forces that come together really magically that allow this forest to survive. And it's the reason why, when I said before, it's one of 2 maritime holly forests in the world. It's the reason why this is such a unique and rare habitat, because it's not something that is easy to produce. It's not something that exists. The conditions have to be so particular for holly trees to be growing the way they are right now, as close to the ocean as they are right now in the Sunken Forest. Now, I just want to real quick go through some of the tree species. This is one of my favorite pictures. You'll forgive me. It's my background. I've used it a few times in the slideshow. But real quick, I want to talk about, we have a lot of oaks, we have a lot of maples, we have a lot of pines in the forest. I'm not really going to focus on those today because a lot of these trees don't really make up a majority of the canopy. That said, this photograph is actually of a species of red maple, depending on which catalogs you look in, depending on which identification books you look in. Sometimes this plant is actually identified as a subspecies of red maple, something called swamp maple, which grows in a very swamp-like habitat, just like the Sunken Forest. So we do get oaks, we get maples, we get pines, but they don't really make up a bulk of the canopy. There are actually 3 species of trees that make up most of the canopy. The first we already talked a little bit about. This is American holly. This is the plant that makes the Sunken Forest so special. Take a look at American holly, and again, you're probably already familiar with it. It's got those nice pointed leaves. American holly is actually a species of plant that comes in male and female formats. If you're looking at a female, especially later on in the fall and into the spring, so throughout the whole winter, it is an evergreen, so it's usually green all year round. You'll see little red berries. Those red berries tell you that it's a female tree. Male trees don't get those red berries. You may also notice the really smooth bark on the side of the tree. In the right light, that bark is almost a greenish hue. It's very interesting to look at because once you realize it's got a kind of green to it, you can't not notice it. So you might see it a little bit in this picture. It can be tough to tell with photographs. You may also notice all of these weird little eye-like, they look like knots. They look like little eyes on the side of the trees. Those knots are actually the remnants of old branches. Many trees do this, including holly, but as it grows up, it actually drops its lower branches. The reason why it drops its lower branches is because, well, there's not a lot of sunlight coming through the canopy to feed those lower branches. So it's kind of a waste of the tree's time and resources. When it drops those lower branches, what it leaves behind are those little knots, and those little knots are like the remnants of old branches. So they look like eyes. I always tell kids, don't throw your garbage off the boardwalk because the trees are watching you, but obviously they're not eyes at all. So American holly, Ilex opaca, is the most common species of tree. Next up, we start to see things like sassafras. Sassafras is a really cool tree. A lot of people may already know about sassafras. Sassafras is easy to identify. Oh no, I skipped ahead. I hope you guys didn't see that. Sassafras is really easy to identify because it has 3 different kinds of leaves. Primarily, I do see sassafras with other weird leaves. It can be kind of strange, but there are 3 main leaves. It has a single lobe leaf. It has a double lobe leaf, which looks a little bit like a mitten. And then most of what we're seeing in this picture are these triple lobed leaves. You can see they have 3 lobes. We have a picture on the left, which is kind of like a fall picture. It does change these gorgeous fall colors. One on the right, which I actually took last week, just sassafras. And then on the bottom, we can see some sassafras berries. Typically with the berries on sassafras, birds like to eat them. So you don't really see very many of them because they snatch them up pretty much as soon as they ripen. Now, sassafras, if you're familiar with it, you're probably familiar with it because of root beer. There's a long history of using sassafras roots to produce root beer. You also use it to make tea. It was used traditionally. The leaves could actually be dried and turned into a fine powder that could be used as a filet or as a sort of thickener in a lot of southern dishes, especially popular down in Louisiana and New Orleans. It was very important to like Creole cuisine and things like gumbo and stuff like that. So sassafras has a ton of different uses. Today, we don't really use sassafras anymore. There were some studies done, I believe, in like the 50s and 60s that sort of linked it to sort of carcinogenic materials. So we don't use sassafras all that much in many products. There aren't very many people who still make sassafras root beer. But sassafras has this really important role. Actually, in American history, it was a huge crop for early colonies as the Europeans were starting to colonize the coast. So it's an important plant. One of the things that you may notice about sassafras, if you ever see sassafras, maybe pluck one of the leaves. It's really cool. You can actually grind it up and smell it. When you smell it, are probably going to be very familiar with what you smell because we use that scent, an artificial version of that scent in all sorts of products. I actually have kids, they always come up to me and they smell it and they say, oh, it smells just like Fruit Loops of all things. So it's a scent that you're almost definitely familiar with, whether it's in cleaning products, it smells sort of citrusy, even though, it's something that you don't really think about very often. So that's sassafras. That's the second of the 2 tree species. The last tree species is this one right here. This is called Juneberry. Depending on where you go, it's actually got other names as well. It can be called serviceberry and it can be called shadblow. It's called Juneberry, probably most obviously because it gets its berries in the June, in the month of June. You can see those berries in the bottom left-hand corner. They almost look like blueberries. Very tasty, although they do have little pits in them. So if you're eating them, just be careful. Watch out for the seeds. That said, if you come out to Fire Island, you may see Juneberries. Birds really love to eat them, so you might not even have a chance to snatch them up if you wanted to. Now that's the easiest name to remember. That's the one I usually use, is Juneberry. But the other two names I think are really interesting from a cultural perspective. The first name is Shadblow. It's called Shadblow because its flowers, the flowers that produce these berries later on in the season, its flowers start to appear in the month of May. That's the same time of year a fish called the shad swims up the Hudson River in order to lay its eggs. So if you were a fisherman, especially along the Hudson River Valley, you would actually use this plant to know what time of year you could start fishing for shad. And then the other name I think is the most interesting. It's called serviceberry because those flowers only start to appear on the tree at the end of the winter once the ground beneath the tree has completely thawed. So in the month of May, more or less, in the spring. Now, it's really important because back in the day, before we had bulldozers and tractors and things like that, it was really hard to dig holes in the ground when there was any ice in the ground. They would actually take this plant and plant it in front of funeral homes and inside of graveyards in order to know what time of year you could start digging holes. You could start digging graves and holding funeral services. So that's where the name serviceberry comes from. That's actually a contentious story. There are some other stories about how it might have gotten its name, but I think that's the most interesting. So Juneberry, serviceberry, or shadblow, all common names for the same species of tree. Now, there is one thing that you see in this photograph. We'll take a closer look at it in the next slide. These holes, right? These holes are not a main feature of Juneberry. It doesn't just get these holes. These holes are actually produced by a really cool bird, of all things, called a yellow-bellied sapsucker. Yellow-bellied sapsuckers are pretty small compared to a lot of woodpeckers. They're not as large as some of the other woodpeckers you'll see around. I would almost describe them, I want to say, as like robin-sized, maybe a little smaller than a robin. The reason why they're called yellow-bellied sapsuckers, really their name tells you everything you need to know about them. If you look at this picture, you can see they have kind of a dull yellow belly. It's not really bright like a warbler's belly, but it does have this nice yellow hue on it. And then the other part of its name is sapsucker. So that tells you what it's doing to the tree. It's actually latched onto the side of the tree. It's poking holes into the side of the tree. Those holes will fill up with sap and it'll come back later on to eat that sap. So you'll see these holes all over the forest. It's a really cool feature of the forest. Unfortunately, the sapsuckers are much harder to find. They're very elusive to people. I've only seen a few in my years there. That said, I come out to the Sunken Forest and, you know, every couple weeks I see brand new holes on the trees, which is pretty cool. We also have this really lush and important understory, which is packed with all sorts of different plants, whether it's catbrier, that sort of viney plant on the left with the thorns on it. I always think of a cat's teeth or a cat's claws scratching at you, hence the name catbrier, easy to remember. Next in the middle, really up on top, is poison ivy. We get a ton of poison ivy on Fire Island. One of the reasons why the rangers insist you stay on the trails is to avoid poison ivy. Poison ivy is a very important plant. It is a plant that does help to feed lots of different animals. It is an excellent pollinator. A lot of pollinators frequent it, whether they're ants or other insects. It does provide food for like herbivores, like rabbits and deer. Surprisingly, not a lot of people know this, but poison ivy really only infects us around here the way it does. It doesn't really affect dogs. It doesn't affect deer or anything else like that. It also gets these beautiful little berries. Those berries will turn sort of a cream color. The birds must not like the flavor of those berries or whatever, because they wait to eat those berries until the middle of the winter when everything else is gone. So poison ivy is really important as this food store for birds because they hold off on eating it until they really need to eat it. On the bottom left-hand corner, we have black cherry. That's actually not an understory tree. I apologize. It shouldn't be in this part. It is a tree, although much of the black cherry we see on Fire Island is sort of shrub-sized or saplings, very young black cherries in the Sunken Forest. On the bottom right is going to be a little bit of catbrier, and then those berries you'll see are going to be blackberries. And then on the top right, I included this. This isn't a plant, but this is actually a fungus, this weird orange, almost Cheeto-looking thing. That is called Staghorn Fungus, and it's just one of many different fungi that we get in the Sunken Forest. It's probably the one that you see the most because it's bright orange. It's easy to see. Tend to see this in August and early September, so you might see some out there right now. And again, that's Staghorn fungus. So this understory is really lush. It's absolutely teeming with life. All sorts of different animals will come to the understory. You'll see birds sort of digging around looking for insects and things like that. Moving on a little bit, we also get these freshwater wetlands I talked about before. These freshwater wetlands are within the sunken forest, and they have a whole variety of other species, whether it's blueberry growing in these wetlands or cattails, like the one on the right, that's sort of corn dog looking thing, or Phragmites on the top left-hand corner. That's all very common within the sunken forest, within those sort of boggy or freshwater habitats. Now, moving on to talk a little bit about some of the animals we have on Fire Island. We do get a variety of reptiles. We also get a few amphibians. Some of the most common reptiles we see on the bottom left-hand corner is a tiny little box turtle. Box turtles are really cool. They've got this beautiful yellow shell. The reason why they're called box turtles is because when they get spooked, they go into their shell, just like most turtles, right? They sort of retreat into their shells to protect themselves. But one thing that's unique about the box turtle is that they actually have a little hinge in the front of their shell that closes, and they make themselves a little bone box, hence the name box turtle. Now, not on Fire Island, as far as we know, but over at the William Floyd Estate, there was a gentleman named John Nichols who lived at the William Floyd Estate around the turn of, the turn of the last century, so late 1800s, early 1900s. And one of the things that he liked to do with box turtles is he actually was a scientist. He wanted to monitor them. He would carve his initials and other information into the box turtle shells. And then every time he found it, he would log it. So he would know how old the box turtle was and where it was going. One really cool thing about a box turtle is just a few years ago, we found a box turtle that was tagged 100 years to the day by John Nichols. So these guys will survive at least 100 years, if not longer, which I think is pretty remarkable. Despite the fact that they survive, they could live for a whole 100 years. They don't move very far. It's estimated they probably have a range of approximately 1 mile, and they don't really go beyond that range at all in their lifetimes. On the top right-hand corner, there are two different snakes. The one on the left is a garter snake. You're probably familiar with this. These are just the little snakes that you'll see crawling around your garden. Very common here on Long Island. On the right-hand side is this mean-looking snake. It's called a black racer. Very harmless. Might bite you if you were to try to grab them, but not poisonous, not a constrictor, nothing like that. The reason why they're called racers is because they're very fast. And the only time that you ever see a black racer, they're running away from you. Which, can be a bummer. You want to look at them. They're pretty cool. But of course, with all wildlife, we ask you to be mindful and keep your distance. These are just some of the reptiles. We also get amphibians. We get toads. We get salamanders. We get frogs and a variety of other species as well. We also get snapping turtles, which I forgot to add to this slide. We get a lot of snapping turtles in the forest, although box turtles are the most common. We get a huge variety of bird species. The Sunken Forest and Fire Island is situated along something called the Atlantic Flyway, which is a major migratory route for birds. On the left-hand side, we have on top a towhee, and on bottom, a catbird. Not necessarily birds that really migrate very far. On the right, we do have birds that do tend to migrate a little bit more. The catbird and the towhee, the catbird again on the bottom, the towhee on the top left. Those are the most common species. They spend a lot of time looking for insects. You'll also see them looking for berries and things like that in the forest. The really neat thing about the catbirds is that the reason why they're called catbirds is because when you're walking through the sunken forest, you'll hear something sounds just like a cat meowing at you. They go, meow, and that's the catbird. Catbirds are funny though, because they're a little bit like mockingbirds. They like to copy the sounds of other bird species. So you don't just hear the meow, sometimes you hear all sorts of other weird sounds coming out of them. The towhee on the top left-hand corner, it's got the white belly, the orange side, and the gray or black cape on its back and head, hood. That is a really cool bird, sort of robin size, maybe a little smaller than a robin. And the main noise that they make sounds just like their name too. They are called towhees. The sound they make sounds like a towhee or a sort of sound. So you'll hear them a lot in the forest. In the middle, we have a small warbler. There's actually a huge variety of different species of warbler, tons of different species that happen to be yellow, including yellow warblers like this one. We also get yellow rumped warblers. We get starlings. We get orioles. We get redstarts. We get a huge variety of different small songbirds passing through. And then on the top right-hand side is a bird that we do actually are starting to see more year-round now than we used to in the past. They do migrate, but it's not unheard of to see them in the winter of all times. That's probably something as Long Islanders you're familiar with, and that there's called an osprey. We've been really lucky to see the osprey in the last few years. Ever since I've been working at Fire Island, I've seen a huge explosion in their numbers. Their numbers actually declined really sharply between the 1950s and throughout the 1960s as a result mainly of pesticides, things that we were using to get rid of mosquitoes. Also happen to have devastating effects on osprey and other hawks, other falcons, other raptors. It actually causes their eggshells to develop improperly in a way that can make them easy to crush by the adult birds, which is really unfortunate. Ever since we stopped using those pesticides, osprey have sort of been on the rise again. They've sort of been returning to this landscape. And really just like in the last 10 years, there's been this huge boom. Honestly, very lucky to see this. We also see sometimes bald eagles, cool. They're starting to come back. Although this tends to be, the Sunken Forest tends to be osprey territory. Very territorial birds. You don't really see osprey and bald eagles interacting with each other very often, but it is possible to see a bald eagle from the Sunken Forest. And then we do get some mammals. On the left, we have a red fox. They're really cool, really beautiful, very smart animals, mainly scavengers. They are omnivorous, so they kind of eat whatever they can get a hold of. I've seen them eat crabs. I've seen them eat skates. They'll literally pull skates out of the water. One time I noticed a fox at Sailor's Haven was doing this thing where he would pull skates, which are these sort of stingray-like looking things, actually pull skates out of the water, rotting skates that had already died. It will grab the skate, it will place the skate out on the beach and then hide and wait for seagulls to start picking at that skate and then go and grab the seagulls. So these guys are really clever, really smart. We do see them in the Sunken Forest. I'd say 6 years ago, we had a huge population of foxes. You'd go out there and you'd see probably a fox if you were looking in the right place most days across all of Fire Island. And then unfortunately, there was a big decline in the population of foxes on Fire Island. They actually started to succumb to various illnesses, in particular mange, which is the sort of mite that gets into their skin and makes them really itchy, caused a little bit of die-off in the population. So that was really sad to see. That said, foxes are they're sort of like very influenced by the number of other species. So when we see a huge explosion in the number of mice or the number of rabbits on Fire Island, we usually also see a corresponding increase in the number of fox. And I honestly think in the next few years, it'll probably be a pretty good time for the foxes. So foxes, they sort of change a lot, their population size. Some years are really good years for foxes, other years are not. And then on the right-hand side, we have deer. Deer are these magnificent animals. You'll see them pretty much all across Fire Island. We do have a little bit of a problem with deer. Their population is pretty big. We estimate a population just a few years ago, back before we were doing some deer management, we estimated around 400 deer on Fire Island for a habitat that can really only naturally sustain 100 deer. And that's a problem because they start to have an impact on places like the Sunken Forest. They start to actually overly graze places like the Sunken Forest, cause the understory to disappear, cause, for example, holly saplings to disappear. So they can have a big impact on the landscape. The question is, why are there so many deer on Fire Island? And the easy answer is just people like to feed them. Park rangers, we're always telling people not to feed the deer. It's really important you don't feed the deer. First off, you will get a ticket if you get caught feeding the deer. We do not like people feeding the deer. We want to make sure that all of the wildlife on Fire Island stays wild. We want them to be well adapted to their natural environment. And plus, a lot of the things people like to feed deer can make them very sick. Unfortunately, that is still a problem in a lot of the private communities and things like that. So we're always trying to teach people and encourage them not to feed the deer because we want this healthy relationship with the deer on the island. But the deer are really cool to see. You'll see male deer, they have the antlers on top of their head. This time of year, those antlers have sort of begun losing the velvety fuzz that you see in the middle of the summer. And later on in the season, they'll begin to rut. They'll start to compete with each other, where the males will actually smash their antlers together in competing for mates and things like that. This picture is actually a female deer, so this one doesn't have antlers. But then in the middle of the winter, none of the male deer have antlers either. So it can be pretty difficult to tell the difference between the two of them. We won't get too much into that. Now, I told you guys that I really wanted to return to this picture here. This picture is really important for a bunch of reasons. One reason is if you look off in the distance, you'll see a blue pipe in the ground. That blue pipe is a really important part of some research that we're doing in the Sunken Forest right now. We have scientists who are going into the Sunken Forest, again, this globally rare maritime habitat, only one of two on the entire planet. And they've been monitoring the water table in the Sunken Forest, and they've been noticing some pretty unfortunate, things. If you take a look at this picture, you can see there are a ton of trees in the middle of this body of water. These trees have died off. The trees sort of at the edges of this body of water probably aren't doing very well. Well, this is a place that when people first started to come to the Sunken Forest to do science here, when they first started to analyze it, this is a place that used to be dry in the 1960s and that is starting to, over time, become more and more wet. Well, that little blue pipe is in the ground because we're using that in part to test the water table here on Fire Island, to check it for its level, how high up the water table is, and also to check it for salinity. This is a part of Fire Island where we're starting to see really the first impacts of anthropogenic climate change. Just real quick climate science. Obviously, when we have greenhouse gases being produced as we burn fossil fuels, that greenhouse gas gets into the atmosphere. It tends to heat up the atmosphere. It kind of captures some of the sun's radiation, and it causes warming, right? Of course, it doesn't warm across the globe. There are some places that get colder as a result of this sort of climate disruption. But here on Fire Island, what we're starting to see is that as sea levels rise, water tables on Fire Island, and especially water tables inside of the Sunken Forest, are rising too. The vadose, which is that layer of thin, well, we'll jump into that in a minute, that dry land between the surface of the ground and the water table that I was talking about earlier, is starting to thin. And our analysis has really shown that the water table in the Sunken Forest is rising pretty much in concert with sea level rise. So this is a NOAA like sort of map you guys can check out online. Just gives you an idea of what happens when sea level rises. This is Sunken Forest. Here on the right-hand side, you guys can see the marina that takes you into Sailor's Haven. The Sunken Forest is wedged between Ocean Bay Park, Point of Woods over there on the left-hand side, and that marina. It's sort of in that landscape. So this is sort of an aerial photo of how the island looks now. This is the Sunken Forest after 1 foot of sea level rise. You can start to see water appearing in places where there wasn't water before. With 2 feet of sea level rise, you can see how much of the Sunken Forest is actually eroding away or sinking, disappearing. And then 4 feet of sea level rise, you can really see it having a massive impact on the Sunken Forest. Now, the reason for that is we have obviously this water table underneath the island. This water table is propped up by salt water. So as more and more salt water rises, as the ocean levels rise, that salt water is actually going to push the fresh water closer and closer to the surface. That vadose zone, which again is that area between the water table and the surface of the land, that vadose zone is starting to thin. And we're seeing that throughout the Sunken Forest. Just in the last 10 years that I've been here, I've noticed that. And it is, somewhat unfortunate. Now, we are really hopeful because despite these areas that are starting to flood, possibly as a result of climate change, there are parts of the Sunken Forest that are actually very high above the water table. So there are certainly places that we can make sure we preserve and protect together, but we really need to be mindful of the landscape. We need to protect the landscape as much as possible. We need to manage the sort of relationships between people and wildlife that has an impact on this landscape. And of course, that goes, that's everywhere from not feeding the deer to doing what we can to sort of, have an effect, a positive effect on the globe and climate change, things like that. So all that is to say, again, Sunken Forest is a really cool place. I'm getting to like the end of my time here and I don't want to answer questions, so I apologize if I'm cramming so much here. Sunken Forest is a really cool place. One of 2 maritime holly forests in the world, filled with all sorts of really cool plants and really cool animals. It is a place that I love. It's a place that I hope you guys visit, that you can love too. And it's definitely a place that we want to preserve in the future. It's definitely something we want to protect. To skip over these next 2 slides, be mindful when you're visiting. We are responding obviously to a global pandemic. COVID-19 is a big problem. Make sure you bring your mask, because if you're going to go inside it, like the visitor center, for example, we are asking folks to wear masks indoors. But one of the cool things about, the outdoors is that when you are able to socially distance, it is, oftentimes a safer place. So we encourage you to come out. So that's just to sort of wrap up. I want to give a few minutes for questions and answers. Again, my name is Kelsey. I work for the National Park Service for Fire Isalnd National Seashore. And that's my presentation. I'm going to stop my sharing. And we can sort of start to unmute people. Again, I apologize if that end was like sort of cramped in. I just wanted to make sure we had time. I'm seeing questions. Folks can unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question. Real quick, going to go through the chats and read things. Do you need to make an appointment to visit and get a ranger tour of the Sunken Forest? You can make an appointment, especially if you have a group. We often do special tours for Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, schools, libraries, things like that. You can come to the Sunken Forest on your own. I forgot to mention, we do have self-guided maps if you just wanted to walk through on your own. We also will soon have a self-guided audio tour. You'll hear my voice telling you all about the Sunken Forest. But you don't necessarily need to make an appointment. Do you need any precautions against ticks and mosquitoes? It's a good question. I apologize for not mentioning it earlier. We do have a big problem with ticks and mosquitoes on Fire Island. Mosquitoes really more of an annoyance than anything. We monitor them very closely for things like diseases, like things that can make us sick. And unfortunately, knock on wood, haven't had an issue with that. So annoying, bring bug spray. This time of year, you might want to bring bug spray. I always tell people, bring your bug spray, put it on when you feel like you need it, because most of the year in the Sunken Forest, you don't even really need bug spray. That's ticks are a big problem. Ticks can transmit things like Lyme disease. We have wonderful boardwalks that run through the Sunken Forest, which make it really easy to avoid ticks. Ticks don't jump, they don't fly, nothing like that. So as long as you stay on the boardwalks, you're usually okay.
A very interesting Zoom. It's just about over. You're just answering questions about Fire Island, about Sunken Forest.
Did you have a question? Just moving along with the chats. Let's see. We have somebody else asked about ticks. Big problem. But if you stay on the boardwalk trails, I walk through the Sunken Forest most days and I don't even interact with, I don't see any ticks. And it's because I'm not walking through the brush. I'm not getting close to the grass. I'm just being mindful. I do always check myself at the end of the day anyway. Do you find deer antlers on the forest floor when they molt? Yeah, they do molt. They lose their antlers. Yeah, you see them every now and then. I actually haven't found one in the Sunken Forest in a while. When they rut, that's the term for when the males start to compete. They have their antlers, they start smacking into each other and losing their antlers. When they rut, they're usually out in open spaces like the swale. So you don't find as many antlers in the forest. When you find the antlers, they're usually in the swale area. That said, I have found antlers in the forest, which is honestly pretty cool. Could you cover Sunken Forest and Sailor's Haven in the same day? Sailor's Haven is where the Sunken Forest is. So if you're going to the Sunken Forest, you're taking the ferry to Sailor's Haven. Absolutely doable. You can take a nice nature walk through the Sunken Forest and then go hang out on the beach for a few hours. The trail through the Sunken Forest is 1.5 miles on the long end. So however long it takes you to walk 1.5 miles, it's, it doesn't take too much time. You can spend the whole day in the forest if you want to, but most people really like to go to the beach and to the forest. What are we doing to control the deer population? Unfortunately, we have had to remove some of the deer. There was an active cull a few years ago. But really the big things that we're asking people to do is to make sure that you secure your garbage and that you don't feed the deer. We're trying to break this culture of feeding the deer, especially on parts of Fire Island where it has become sort of popular and has become a habit. It is really the feeding of the deer that has sustained such a large population out here. How do you become a park ranger for Fire Island? I'm a marine bio major and I want to go into park services. Well, I would encourage you actually to give us a call because I don't know how much time we have left, but we would honestly love to talk to you. We do have marine, actually one of my coworkers is a recent marine biologist graduate. All sorts of different internships are available to sort of get your foot in the door. I actually started off as a volunteer when I was 13. So volunteering is always a really useful thing if you're looking for a career in the National Park Service. If you want to just give it a try and just apply for National Park Service jobs, The way to do that is by visiting a website. It's called usajobs.gov. That's where the federal government posts all of their open positions, including park rangers and seasonal park rangers. So as a marine biologist, you're going to be probably looking for biotech positions. Just go to USA Jobs and look it up. But if you want to talk more, we can definitely talk more. Now, I just want to give folks an opportunity to type in any more questions or to unmute yourselves. I know we are past time now, but I'm here to answer questions if you need. Can you request a tour with you on a Saturday or a Sunday? With me specifically, if you want to request a tour with me specifically, you're welcome to give us a call and say, and maybe I can work out my schedule to do that. But all of our rangers are really knowledgeable. And we do public tours on both Saturdays and Sundays at 11:30, all the way through till when the ferries stop running, which is usually mid-October. Right around Columbus Day, they stop running. And in the summer, up until Labor Day, we were doing tours every single day at 11:30. Does anyone else have any questions? Anyone want to unmute yourselves and say anything?
Just a quick thank you.
Oh, thank you.
It was a good talk.
Thanks.
Glad you were doing it and not me.
I'd like to thank you also. You're a very dynamic speaker.
Thanks. I appreciate that. It means a lot.
Yeah, we all want to thank you. This was a great talk. It's a resource that I was not aware of it. So I'm glad you're able to give the talk and explain to people.
Yeah, and we hope to see you out here. The real goal of this is to get people outside. As cool as computers are, we definitely want to see you in the park. You'll probably see me or somebody wearing a funny hat just like mine. And if you see somebody with a funny hat like mine, come on up. We're happy to answer questions, point things out, give you a tour, anything.
Thank you.
Good night.
Great job.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks one last time from the library. Have a great night. And thanks again, Kelsey.
Yes, you too. Thank you.
Take care.